Welcome to the Ministry Solvers podcast, where we help find ministry solutions to your problems. Today, we're going to be continuing our conversation with small group experts Bill Search. Bill has been a leading voice in the small groups movement, authoring multiple articles and books, including the popular Essential Guide for Small Group Leaders. He was senior advisor for www.smallgroups.com and Christian Bible Studies at Christianity Today. We hope you enjoy this conversation.
So one thing that is interesting about the history of small groups is the fact that after the Acts 2 story, there was an intense persecution of the church. And then from that point on, Constantine came into the picture. And then from there was kind of a drop off with small groups. And then there was a resurgence with small groups. So, and there were people like John Wesley, Anthony Pernick, and Zinzendorf and Spencer that kind of helped kind of get that going. So can you talk about sort of the history of small groups with that?
Yeah, it's really fascinating is if you track the history of small groups, there has actually always been some strand of a small gathering of people. They may call it different things, but they were there. The first 2 to 3 centuries in the life of the church, there are no church buildings. They're only meeting in homes because they either don't have permission to build fit for purpose church buildings, or they don't have the resources to do it. And so they're meeting in spaces wherever they can meet, catacombs, people's homes, out on the beach, in the back room of a shop, wherever. So that means that archaeologists can't really dig these things up and go, well, here's the church. It's not until the legalization of Christianity. And some people view Constantine's legalization as a bad thing. I don't know if it's bad or good. I'll let God sort that out. There's been good mixed with bad in all eras of church life. So with that being said, though, there's always been these little clusters of people that would gather together, whether it was scholars in educational institutions, priests, pastors. Then in the Protestant Reformation, there's kind of a resurgence of these things as that begins to grow. And a lot of times, and this is still a thing, a lot of times clergy are nervous when a small gathering of people from the church go meet in someone's home and talk about the sermon. Sometimes pastors think, oh, this is wonderful, but sometimes it's the ground of dissension, and it has been sometimes. So that's why there's been kind of a feeling about, and in some churches that is still the case, where pastors say, I don't want that, because they get nervous about what those people might do. Or some people worry that a small group of people get together and they're going to somehow venture into heresy. My answer to that is I always point out that all the great heresies of the church were started by bishops, pastors, priests, and scholars. All of them carry the names of people who were really important, Pelagius and otherwise. There are some heretics out there, and they didn't come up with their heresy in a small group. They came up with it in their pulpits. So I'm not worried about that issue. So all this to say is you're absolutely right. You named some important names there. John Wesley was trying to revitalize the Anglican Church. He didn't start the denomination. He didn't start Methodist or Wesleyan. Those came after his death. He was trying to bring a vibrancy to the Anglican Church through additional meetings. He had some meetings that resembled a Sunday school class with 100 people. But you could only come to those would meet on Sunday night. You could only come to those Sunday night meetings if you were in a small group. So you could come twice, and then you had to produce a ticket at the door. And that ticket would be given to you by what we would call your small group leader. They called them different things. But that small group would be mixed gender, and that small group would also be mixed income and professions and all this. And that would be a group that had a purpose. They were trying to work on certain things. And then there was even yet a smaller group that was gender specific, where you'd really work on the moral fabric of your life. And that was a place of confession. So what we think of the small group, they did not confess sin in that group because it was mixed gender and all this. They were really kind of taking the sermon from the Sunday night gathering to another level and applying it to life and this sort of deal. So the deeper questions happen in that small thing. So Wesley trucks along, and then when he passes away, that movement kind of dies off, and they start denominations that function more like churches. And there's moments all through the 1800s where there's that. But what we think of today really kind of was a surge in the 70s and 80s, where it was the perfect kind of convergence of where people were living and where they were at. And for a variety of reasons, different denominations and groups, from Pentecostals to Roman Catholics, ended up discovering the value of these smaller settings of people coming together and encouraging and supporting one another. So the neat thing is that we're finally starting to research, and we're starting to see what works and what doesn't work, because that's the piece that's missed in the modern era. Is anyone can write a book and say whatever they want about small groups, and it may or may not be true. Years and years ago, I'll end my answer with this. Years and years ago, I read a book it was very well read. I mean, it was a very popular book. I won't name it because I still admire the person who wrote it, but it was about how to essentially build a vibrant structure in your church. And I went and visited his church, and found out from his own pastoral staff that, as they called it, this was an aspirational book. They weren't doing it. And so, no, that's, to me, a type of that's inappropriate. I'll just leave it at that. I'd rather just write about what works. So anyhow, all this to say, in the modern era, we're finally getting to the point where we are doing a better job of vetting and knowing what works. So that's not as historic. There's some good. Roland Banks, I think it is, wrote a book. I might got that name wrong. No, I think he wrote on Luther. There's a handful of books out there that talk about the history of the group's movement. And if you Google enough, you'll find them. That was a big fascination of mine. So at one time, and for the listener out there who's like, I love history, they'll find those.
That's good. Yes, what's interesting is that these people that I mentioned, like Zindendorf and Spencer,
Uh,
they were unsung heroes in kind of catapulting the First Great Awakening.
yep.
And then one of the things you mentioned too was the fact that their confessions were a lot deeper, right? Whereas in the traditional small group these days, like, I mean, you may get to a really deep confession in terms of being able to confess sin, but they went
Yeah.
all out when it came to confessing sin. And so, what do you think we can learn from
Sure.
that period of church history that
Yeah.
our groups
Well,
need more of today?
I'm more conversant on Wesleyan,
Mhm.
his roots, because that's our church kind of roots
Uh-huh.
I serve. So Wesley really was a proponent of that confession of sin, but he was not a proponent of it in mixed company.
Mhm.
Uh, his what There's a book called The Class Meeting, and I'll try to email you the author later. I can't think of it off the top of my head. He's a retired Asbury Seminary professor, so the guy knows. He did the research on it. I think the author's passed away. But the class meeting, he breaks down and explains, because there's a lot of misunderstanding. People invoke Wesley's name without knowing what Wesley actually did.
Mhm.
So the larger gathering that met on Sunday night, as I mentioned, would function a lot more like a large Sunday school class, or maybe even a small church,
Mhm.
because it would be 100, 120 people in it. And the meeting halls, there's still some of those old meeting halls still in England. I don't know how many of them are still used for that purpose, but they're still there. And then they break down into groups of about 12, and that was a vetted, trained leader. But that was to to talk about the sermon and to do the application. But there was no confession there, because men and women were in the same room. And then also businessmen or business women with peasants would be in the same place.
Mhm.
Maybe an employer with their employee potentially would be in the same place. So you really couldn't have confession in that setting. That dual relationship doesn't work.
Gotcha.
So it still doesn't work no matter how much we force it. So then the confession. where it was to be the change, that was amongst a more similar group, and that was 6 to 8 men or 6 to 8 women,
Mm-hmm.
trained leader. And that was where they eyeball to eyeball said, hey, how are you doing at this and this and this? And they reworked some of the questions from the old Wesley Holiness Club at Oxford. I always chuckle a little bit. People go, see what Wesley did in Oxford in his small group. He asked these questions. Wesley didn't think he was a Christian at Oxford. He was preparing to be a priest, but Wesley's own testimony was he became a Christian later, which scholars then, it's up to the Lord to know when Wesley, maybe he became a Christian at 8. We don't know. It's up to the Lord to decide those things. But all that to say, we have to be careful when we pull in some of those historical things. So in the little gender specific group,
Mm-hmm.
that's where confession took place. And that's where they were pushing for life change. So I bring that up because that actually tracks with every experience I've ever had in small groups. If you want confession, you got to separate men from women. Unless you want the confession to be things like, oh, I indulge my children too much, unless you want the confession to be real shallow. Sometimes I have a bad attitude in traffic. Okay. But those are what will get confessed in a broader group. But you have to be knee to knee with people you really trust. And it can't be more than about a half dozen people. And it really does need to be the same gender. And that's actually when you check out like things like Celebrate Recovery.
Mm-hmm.
They do step studies, and that's what they have found too, is those they put gender specific together for specific issues. That's required. Otherwise it breaks down. People aren't going to cut. No, the traditional sin patterns that plague each gender aren't going to get expressed in front of the opposite gender. Or the group just got real weird and someone's not coming back next week. So I hope that answer.
That's good.
I hope that's not a disappointing answer,
No.
but it's important when we dive into the historical pieces to keep the record straight on what those folks found. In Zinzendorf, his primary contribution was missions.
Mm-hmm.
So that small group was a global missions generating engine. So they went across the world doing global missions. That was what their deal was. I mean, I'm not saying they didn't have confession of sin and study the word and all those other
Right.
things, but that was a huge piece of what their deal was.
No, I appreciate it. That's great. So as we talk about churches that perhaps still just have a Sunday school model, or they do breakouts or nudge your neighbor doing Wednesday night Bible study, would you say that is effective as going through a curriculum where there's actually a small group of 8 to 12 meeting for like 12 weeks?
You're just talking about the duration. Is a short-term group good enough? Is that the question?
Right, because it's not just as a short-term group good
Yeah.
enough, but for
Yeah.
churches that say that, well, we don't necessarily need we don't need small groups to meet for
Mhm.
12 weeks when we're
Yes.
doing Sunday school, or when we're doing nudge your neighbor, and they can just talk to their neighbor and go through these 3 discussion questions. So
Yeah.
would you say that's as effective as an actual group of people that are meeting in a home for 8 to
Yeah.
12 weeks?
Such a great, the difficulty in giving you the clearest and succinct answer is the variables that always come up. What if you're in a small church and your Sunday school class is 8 people?
Mm-hmm.
And you've been meeting forever and you know the ins and outs of each other's lives and you pray for each other. Well, isn't that a small group? It might be actually. I don't, there's that variable of regularity, of focus on Christ, of invested in each other's lives. You might be too invested in each other's lives. You might know too much. Um, but if you're talking about my Sunday school class that, is quite large,
Mm-hmm.
then the people in that class aren't going to get the care. It's not going to give them the chance to talk about and apply if there isn't a smaller space for them to do that. So there does need to be some deeper connections. In some communities I've lived in, people had some of these deep friendships because they had lived there for so long that they had what we strive for in building small groups. Now, much of my ministry has been spent in fast growing areas. You know, you're in Dallas Fort Worth, you grow by 100,000 people a weekend, I think. You know, every time I'm down there, I think, man, is this a new highway? I think it is. You know, I'm in Oklahoma City, which is growing as well, but not at the same clip, but it's growing. So the places I've lived, when people come into a new area, they don't have relationships. They have to get those relationships. The old question of who would you call at 2 a.m. to come watch your kids while you go run somebody to the hospital? Well, you don't have those people if you don't have those people. You know, you can't put that on the HOA Facebook group because nobody's awake at 2 a.m., hopefully checking it.
Right.
But you should have those people in your life. And so the question I'd have is how connected are your people?
Mm.
How how relationally connected are your people? You might be getting good biblical content in a Sunday school class, but there isn't the relationship connection. So how do you bolster that? How do you create more relational connectedness? And so a small group strategy is going to be a key part to that. So in that setting, as I mentioned before, in simple small groups, I talked about groups having these different kind of levels of intensity. If you have a church with a real great Sunday school structure where a lot of people participate in it, then the small group would be a place where the relationship would be high and maybe the study part would be low. Because in Sunday school, the study part's real high and the relationship's just lower. Has to be. So that kind of a strategy is important. The other piece to consider is even in our church. So last weekend we had 1,500 people in all of our Sunday school classes, but that still was less. That was still about a quarter of the people, maybe a little more than a quarter. That was about a third of our adult attendance. So not bad, but that means that two-thirds aren't connected that way. And even if I say, well, there's some that don't come to Sunday school every week. So let's say it was 50-50. Well, then what do you do with the other 50%? You know, if you're trying to create systems and structure for people to attach themselves to, not everybody's going to go to a classroom. Not everybody can go to a classroom. So you still need to think about those people not attached. And if you're a church that has lots of programs, add small groups to that because that will be an important part of your ministry. If you're a church that has a vibrant Sunday school ministry, as I do, having small groups as part of your strategy is an important part of developing that cohesion in ministry. So it isn't to point one is better than the other. It's to
Mhm.
see these things as complements of each other. Which incidentally, for the people listening who are going, hey, we have small Sunday school, and I want to do small groups because it's better. Whatever you do, don't go to your pastor and say, well, we have these Sunday school, but small groups are better. I read a book. You better have a clean LinkedIn profile because your pastor's not going to appreciate that. But if you say, you know, we have this wonderful thing and it does wonderful things, but there is a thing we could add that would make our ministry even stronger. What would it take for us to add this? Now, in the oldie days of small group ministry, it was like, burn that down to build this. Well, why do that? When I worked at the church in Louisville, at any given Sunday morning, we could have about 4,000 people, or no, I guess it was 2,200 people in a Sunday school class. We had that many Sunday school rooms and seats. So we had a attendance at that location of 16,000.
Mm.
That included kids too. So all this to say is I was told by one of my bosses actually at the time. He said, you know, if it's up to me, we'd get rid of Sunday school. And I oversaw both. I oversaw Sunday school and small groups there. And I said, man, if you get rid of Sunday school, let me know. I'm going to get my lawn chair and sit on your front lawn and watch everybody burn your house down with you in it. I said, because that will just make everybody angry. How do you explain all those empty rooms over an idea? I said, how about this? What if we build both programs with vibrancy and strength? I think we could do that. and we went for that goal instead. I convinced him not to lose his house in a fire.
That's
so
good.
that's diplomacy. Since a lot of the people listening to this probably will be ministry leaders, we always have to think about how we diplomatically approach suggestions for change in a ministry. And that's been one of my specialties through the years is continuous improvement of the things we're trying to do and editing out and eliminating the things that don't do what we hoped they would do. But to do it all with grace because people are invested in these things. These are brothers and sisters in Christ that built these things. So we need to be real sensitive with how we approach it. So I'm taking the question much further away than from where you started, Aaron. Sorry, you might want to get us back on track.
No, that's great, and I'm glad you said that. And I was gonna say I was like, but let's just be honest, Bill. Like some ministry programs need to be burned to the ground.
They do.
They
That's right.
do. They
They do.
do. And
Yes.
but I like what you said about doing it gracefully,
Yeah.
tactfully, and diplomatically.
Yeah.
And not just saying, hey, we need to get rid of our Sunday school program and just do small groups, but hey, let's do something that would actually strengthen the church a little bit better
Yeah.
regard. Because I'll be honest, I mean, there's some churches out there where it's competition. It's competition in terms of what ministry programs they are promoting versus other ministry programs that they're not promoting, and sometimes Sunday school or small groups can take a back seat to those
That's right.
things, and then you have spiritually immature Christians that are now a part of these ministries that are
Mhm.
now representing the church, and everyone else is getting the leftovers of that, versus having spiritually mature people that are actually doing the work because they're being discipled, they're in Sunday school, they're in small groups, and programs are built around those things.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I hope I'm glad you clarified that. What I'm not saying is keep everything your church does. If you are the steward of a ministry, you are a steward of a ministry, which means part of good stewardship is every now and then going into the pantry and getting rid of the things which the expiration date has passed. So not everything churches do are beneficial, and
Hmm.
they're not all building people into further Christ likeness. What they're doing is they're just building a program or what have you. At one time, the church I currently serve at one time had a sports and fitness ministry. And there was an era when lots of churches got into sports and fitness. And for some churches, that's still a key component to what they do. But what we found, and this is, of course, before I came, what we found is that sports and fitness ministry was actually just a place where a lot of our retirees went to get a free cup of coffee and hang out with one another in the cafe area. They were, and occasionally they might work out on a machine or something like that. But of course, every church that started sports and fitness started it as an evangelism strategy. I don't know a single church in America that built $1 million gymnasium or sports fitness center that wanted just for their church members to be more physically fit. That's a nice goal, but the church wasn't going to pay for that. Well, over time, what most churches found is, well, it was just the church people using it. Not the idea was you bring your neighbor or your colleague from work to the free sports and fitness center. And there's a big church in our neighborhood that has one, and they actually, as I understand it, are using it for that purpose. Marvelous. I think that's great.
Right.
However, we got rid of ours because all the people that were coming, like I said, were either retirees or people we already got. And we needed the lands. We needed the land. We needed the space. So we just built it. We used it for other things. We didn't just mothball the room. So part of that, like that's a good example there, is when you are eliminating a ministry, what you have to do is properly, with no vendetta, assess that ministry and how it's done. And if it's not as effective or effective at all, you begin to step on the air hose of it. You cut the budget of it. You curtail the hours of it or whatever you do to kind of taper it down. But then the other thing you do is you have to, if it's using space and resources, you have to reallocate those for something that is accomplishing the goal better. So it's not This is where a church that has a small Sunday school structure, I would never say get rid of your Sunday school, because what are you going to do with those rooms? However, if you come up with another purpose for those rooms, and churches I have served, their rooms were used for kids space. First church I served, we had like 2 rooms for meeting space for adults, but they couldn't be used for Sunday school simply because we didn't have space. We are building in a location, we're a multi-location church. Well, one of our locations was built years ago without any education space for adults, and we decided we're going to add that because that is an important part of what we do. Well, it's a $2 million construction project to add 4 or 5 classes. Most churches are not going to drop that kind of money to add a program. Right. So that's where small groups is actually very affordable. It usually involves 1 staff member and some budget dollars. It's the cheapest ministry to disciple adults in the church. It doesn't require any maintenance or upkeep. It just requires staffing, attention, and the development of your people. So
that's good. I like what you said there, and just being able to, like you said, properly assess, right? Yeah. Then being able to step on the air hose and cut off budget. Mm-hmm. Like, I think those are some things that you just don't necessarily learn in seminary, that you have to kind of learn while you're in it, and can be really difficult to do, especially when so-and-so that's over it is paying tithes and doing this, and they feel like they have so much influence, and you don't want to step on anyone's toes. But I think there could be a lot more said there about how to navigate that well. So I appreciate you for speaking to that a little bit.
That'd be a fun topic for a different day, how to kill a ministry without killing the people.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So now that you mentioned that, we'll have to work on that for sure.
Yeah.
I love it. So for churches that are like, this is all great, I don't have small groups, I would like to have small groups. Where do I start in terms of being able to really build this program? And then is there any systematic trainings or anything like that you would recommend for me to be able to train up leaders, to train up coaches, things of that nature?
Thank you for listening to the Ministry Solvers podcast. We hope that you were blessed by part 2 of our interview with Bill Search. And we hope that you will join us for part 3 of our interview as Bill dives deeper into how to raise up leaders for small groups, and also talks about recommended resources for small groups as well. And so it's going to be a jam-packed finale, and we hope that you can join us. And if you haven't already, please make sure you subscribe at www.msolvers.org for future updates. As always, may God bless you, and may you continue to be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain. Thank you, and God bless.